Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to discuss 12 gauge 3-inch shells versus 3.5-inch shells. Now, what is kind of the genesis of this discussion? It's two parts here. So the first part is when I was doing research for the 10 gauge versus 3.5-inch 12 gauge, I actually ran across a thread where people were debating this subject of 3-inch to 3.5-inch 12 gauge. So that stood out in my mind, and though I've already previously reviewed the 10 gauge versus 3.5-inch, I decided to kind of bust this out as its own review as well. Now, in addition to that, there's a lot of new people to the firearms community in the last year, and some of them might be looking to get into some duck hunting or other types of waterfowl hunting, and they might be asking themselves the questions about the differences between these two cartridges. Or in general, they might have bought a shotgun that has a 3.5-inch chamber, or were looking at shotguns, the only difference that they found was the length in chamber, and they wanted to better understand what was going on with that. So this video is going to kind of touch on that process as well. Now, the important thing here, guys, is that the majority of this video, we are going to be talking about the differences for waterfowl hunting, because when you discuss this, this is where a lot of it gets levered at. Now, when we look at the purely data-driven aspect between 3-inch and 3.5-inch shells, it's a little bit under-enthusiastic in terms of velocity. Velocities, if you spend enough time looking around, really aren't that different. And that is primarily because we're dealing with the same cartridge, just lengthened. But the actual amount of powder, now the powder might be different, but the amount of powder doesn't really change between the two. You can still only fit so much into a 12 gauge high brass shell. That does not change if it's 3.5 or 3-inch. But what does change is the shot load. And that is actually where the entire argument starts to develop. And this is where things get a little bit interesting. So, let's say let's pick a common shot size, like number 4. And let's say, just picking some numbers out of the air, that would roughly, in a 3-inch shell, be a 1 1/8 ounce load. And in a 3.5-inch shell, that would be a 1 9/16. All right, so what's that difference come to? Like, I understand that like 9/16 is more than 1 1/4 or 1 1/8, but what does that actually translate to in number of pellets? Well, that would be, in number 4s, a difference of about 39 pellets more in the 12 gauge 3.5-inch shell. Okay, so then right off the bat, based off of that information, I should have a denser shot pattern, which means that I'm throwing out more pellets. I have a higher hit probability, right? That's how that should work. Well, yes and no. This is where things get a little bit interesting. So keep in mind, guys, that we're not necessarily getting, based on powder load, we're not necessarily getting more distance. If we get more distance in a 3.5-inch shell, we're getting it because we have a better propellant being used, something that is burning in such a manner that it's generating pressures to be able to get a higher velocity that's going to project that shot out to a greater overall distance. That's the difference there. But what we run into an interesting dynamic here is the kind of third dimension of shotgun ballistics. Now, I've discussed this before. When we talk about rifle or pistol ballistics, we have, the velocity and grainage or mass of the bullet, which is going to be placed into a formula to be able to project what the foot-pounds of energy are going to be. And that's the data-driven aspect of it, right? That's the numbers on the page that tell us that this is what this bullet does. And from there, we can compare information with a known variable, this number, this foot-pounds of energy, this velocity, and all that kind of stuff, and make projections about what it is what it's going to do. But if you want the actual third dimension of rifle and pistol ballistics, it's what it actually does in the body. So that's like FBI testing or animal testing, something along those lines. Results from a hunt or results from actual officer-involved shootings, all that kind of stuff. That's the third dimension, the intangible. And that's where those numbers that are on a page start to show what it is that they can or can't do. More velocity is not necessarily a better thing. It doesn't actually necessarily equal better expansion or better penetration and all that kind of stuff, because that is also going to be contingent upon bullet construction. Is it constructed in such a manner that it's going to retain enough weight to be able to punch deep enough and expand wide enough, 1.5 times roughly, in order to be able to disrupt enough tissue, have a positive wound track through important areas, and this is where the shot placement thing comes in, as well as primary and secondary wound tracks, all that kind of stuff. That's the third dimension of rifle and pistol bullets. We don't necessarily have that in shotgun shells. Our third dimension is represented in what the actual shot formation looks like. Now, shot inside of a shotgun shell is arranged in columns. And these columns receive the burning gases, the impetus for movement at roughly the same time, which means that they exit the bore and expand more or less in the manner in which they were arranged in their shot columns, or some very close approximation. Now, how that formation of that shot pattern conducts itself is based on things like barrel length, velocities, and then also choke that was used and all that kind of stuff. But what we wind up with is not this wall of lead, or in the case of waterfowl, steel, that just is this straight line that moves forward and expands out and just takes care of everything in its path. It's not how it actually works. Video games and movies have been very misleading in this case. In all reality, your shot pattern looks more like a cloud as it's traveling through the air. So it has a length, width, and depth associated with it. That's going to be fairly reminiscent of how it looked in its shot column when it was in the cartridge. And it's going to be ever expanding and all that kind of stuff. But what that means is that not all of the shot arrives at the same time. And this is where, especially on ducks or geese, a moving target, where that really comes into play. If you're shooting at turkeys, it's not necessarily, that's a very two-dimensional engagement. It's not necessarily very important. But if you're engaging flying animals, those hundredths of a second that it takes for that shot, for the rest of the shot pattern to arrive, could be the difference between maiming and killing an animal, honestly, or even a miss entirely. So the issue that we run into whenever we talk about that third dimension between 3-inch and 3.5-inch shotgun shells is that they are both 12 gauge. They both have the same diameter of about 0.729. So the front of that cloud already has a defined width, if you will. And it's not really changing between the two cartridges. What has changed is how much of a trailing aspect to the cloud that you have. Think of it kind of like pouring a glass of water on the ground. If you're having trouble like visualizing what this shot cloud looks like, it's like a glass of water being poured out on the ground. If you have a moving target going through that stream of water, you're not going to get the entire cup of water on that target. But this is what shotgunners do, or at least guys who are savvy in what it is that they're doing. You swing your barrel with the target, and then you will expose that target to more of your shot cloud. Just like if you swung the glass of water with the intended moving target, you would get more of that water on the target. So, in that respect, the 12 gauge 3.5-inch is not necessarily beating the 3-inch shell. Now, there's a lot of variables between these two, and honestly, a lot of it comes down to what it is that you're trying to do. The 3.5-inch shell can get you more range, though choke tube selection and all that kind of stuff are going to play a major part as to whether or not you're getting the most out of your shot pattern. Now, when it comes to the recoil aspect of this is where things get a little more murky, because recoil is an incredibly subjective thing. What one person finds to be unimaginable in recoil, another person finds to be manageable or acceptable. Now, 3.5-inch shotgun shells are definitely more recoil. I've seen figures quoted as much as 20%. Here's the issue with recoil. Recoil is a difficult thing to just describe to somebody. It's very difficult to put just a number association with recoil, and I've seen a lot of different texts attempt to do this with a KO index and all that kind of stuff. And though a cartridge is going to generate a certain amount of energy, and that's going to have an equal and opposite reaction in, Newtonian physics and all that kind of stuff, that does not mean that it's perceived in the same manner across a lot of people. And that impacts reception is going to be dependent upon that person's stance, that person's body build, whether or not the shotgun is properly fitted to them, the weight of the shotgun, all that kind of stuff. Like, there's a lot of variables that impact 3.5 or recoil in general, but definitely 3.5-inch shells in this case. Operating principle also is going to impact that. So the difference between a pump action and a semi-auto. So I have a Remington Model 870 Super Mag, 3.5 inch chambered 12 gauge. I have never shot 3.5 inch 12 gauge in it because my experience with 3.5 inch 12 gauge out of pump action shotguns has not been positive. I don't care for the recoil, and I've still had no problem reaching and hitting things with 3-inch shells. Now, a prospective buyer might be sitting here going, well, I'll just get the 3.5 inch shell so that I have the option, because options are better, right? And generally, I would agree with you, but there's a very important thing we need to keep in mind about options, is that options are not just positive things. When you have a 3.5 inch chambered shotgun and you run shorter shells in it, you have an increased probability of malfunction because you have a lengthened overall receiver and bolt, which means more travel, which means that there's going to be more energy required to be able to function that action. Be that semi-automatic or pump action, there's still energy that's going to be required to move it. Now, in a pump action, the issue you're going to run into is a phenomenon known as short shucking. Now, in general, pump action shotguns are incredibly reliable, but like all mechanical systems, they have failure points, and the failure point in most pump action shotguns is the user. Even in a 2 3/4 inch chambered gun, you can still have someone short shuck a shotgun and not get the proper movement of the internal parts, which causes a malfunction. If you increase the length of all those operating portions, that doesn't make it better. That actually increases the probability of it occurring to begin with. Just throwing that out there. I'm not saying that it will, I'm just saying that it's a possibility. Now, in addition to that, there's kind of an intangible aspect that most people wouldn't necessarily consider when it comes to 3.5 inch shotguns. And that is, with the longer chamber, you're going to have a different pattern with shorter shells. Now, we're not talking like this is going to be some sort of safety issue with like out of battery detonations and all that kind of stuff. That's not the concern here. What it is that you have a different sort of seating aspect of your cartridge in the chamber, which is going to impact, along with barrel length, choke tube, and all that kind of stuff, your pattern. And what might be an excellent patterning load in one shotgun may not be an excellent patterning load in a longer chambered shotgun. So there's going to be quite a bit of personal testing by the user, getting out to the range, patterning their shotgun, and making sure they're getting the requisite number of hits in vital areas on the targets that they intend to take the shotgun against. That's kind of an intangible aspect, and there's a lot of intangible aspects of shotgunning in general. It doesn't necessarily benefit from a lot of the same research that pistol and rifle bullets get, but these are the things that you need to take into account, and this is why successful waterfowl and other types of hunters go out and pattern their shotguns. It is a very critical aspect. Now, my own opinions, I run, when I do waterfowl hunt, and even turkey, I run 3-inch shells. I have had no issue with proper distance shots dropping ducks and turkey. I've taken multiple turkey and a couple of geese with 3-inch shells. Now, if you're somebody who hunts in an area that, especially late season, the ducks and geese become more wary, a 3.5 inch shell might be more beneficial to you. Just something to keep in mind. But everything has its niche, and check out my 10 gauge versus 3.5 inch 12 gauge video as to whether or not the 3.5 inch 12 gauge properly fits into that long range niche. It's a debate, and it's definitely a discussion, and you guys should totally check out that video. But I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject, guys. So that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.